Hello, everybody. Thanks for taking the time to watch my presentation. My name is Rachel Neiwert. I'm an associate professor of history at St. Catherine University in St. Paul, Minnesota. And today I want to share with you a little bit about my research into children and education in the British Empire. My presentation today is entitled Great Expectations, Growing Up Girl in the British Empire, 1900 to 1950. I know often in our history conferences, we would read a paper to each other, but I thought after a year of online and Zoom life, a little more than a year behind us, that perhaps it might be appreciated if I just shared a presentation and more conversationally shared my observations on what I've been working on. So that's what I'm going to do today. So I want to get us started with a story. And it's a story that I've told in a number of different contexts in relationship to my work. But as I was thinking about this particular presentation, it occurred to me that there's another lens that's important to consider in this work. So many of you are, I'm sure, familiar with the organization, the Boy Scouts, and of course know about its start by Sir Baden-Powell in Britain in the late 19th and early 20th century. I'm interested in a different sort of origin story of the Boy Scouts that it strikes me is a very women-focused story. So in the picture, that group of women that are sitting there on the slightly raised deck there. So this here in the middle is Charlotte Mason, the woman who started the homeschool organization that I research. And sitting next to her here is Lady Baden-Powell, though she's a little bit hard to see. And Charlotte Mason, who runs the homeschool society that I'm interested in, was quite interested in the Boy Scouts. And her educational organization tells a story about the origin of the Boy Scouts that actually comes from Charlotte Mason and her educational society. So I'm going to read the story that Charlotte Mason's educational organization tells. So, in a 1910 interview, when asked, "How did the Boy Scouts start?" Baden-Powell replied, and this is now a quote, "Oh, well, I believe it was largely due to, whom shall we say, a field marshal's governess. It was this way. The brigadier general, as he was at that time, was riding to his homes after a field day, when from the branches of a tree overhead his little son called to him, 'Father, you are shot. I am in ambush, and you have passed under me without seeing me. Remember, you should always look backwards. Remember, you should always look upwards as well as around you.' So the general looked upwards and saw not only his small son above him, but also near the top of the tree, the new governess lately imported from Miss Charlotte Mason's training school at Ambleside." I mean, the story is certainly delightful in and of itself. But there's a number of points of interest in the story. Now, I can't actually find any other places that tell this story as the origin of the Boy Scouts. In this 1910 interview, it goes on to say that Baden-Powell said when he was told this story from Allenby, who's the brigadier general referenced in the story, that it became the impetus for scouting for boys, thus beginning the Boy Scouts movement. And Charlotte Mason's training school at Ambleside, which was called the House of Education, eventually tracks down the particular governess that's referenced in this story to try to prove the truth, to provide the truth of the story. The governess in question, her name is Loveday. And she had been Michael Allenby's governess from September of 1906 to April of 1907. And she sent a letter in the 1930s to Miss Kitching, who takes over as the head of this teacher training school after Charlotte Mason's death, relating this story. Now, there's a lot of historiography on the Boy Scouts. I've only found one place that relates this story. So it is perhaps not exactly the origin story of the Boy Scouts, but an origin story of the Boy Scouts. What I think is interesting in this story, though, is how centrally two women figure. And I say two because I think Charlotte Mason, in fact, lurks largely in this story. right? The first woman, of course, who figures in this story is this governess, Miss Loveday. Right. And the idea here is that Miss Loveday was the one who sort of encouraged this young child under her care, Michael, to go out and play outside and engage in these games that resulted in this, situation or this story coming about. But I think that Charlotte Mason's educational organization, in retelling this story, what they would like to suggest, of course, is that it's their organization's thinking around education and the proper sort of work and activities for children that really creates space um, for Miss Loveday to engage Michael in this way, right? To even create the possibility for this story to happen. Right. So it's interesting to imagine a story about the origins of the Boy Scouts that starts with two women. And yet it perhaps isn't surprising and, is maybe something I should have thought about earlier. That an organization that I think very early on cared very deeply about women and their role in society and cared very deeply about the education of girls, that if they were going to be sort of implicated in the origin of the Boy Scouts, that that work would be central, or would be have at its center women, right? So, who was Charlotte Mason? What was the Parents National Educational Union? And what was the Parents Union School? So, let's a little bit of context and background that'll help us to get to understanding why women and girls were so central in this particular organization. So, Charlotte Mason is the woman in the picture here. This is a picture from the sort of 1870s, 1880s. Charlotte Mason has a complicated background that we don't have time to get into here, but she will eventually end up in England. She becomes a teacher. Because of some health issues that she experiences, her the time that she spends actually in a classroom teaching is somewhat limited. But what she ends up doing instead is she hosts a series of living room talks for women where she shares her ideas on parenting and on education. And it's interesting, of course, that she talks a lot about parenting because Charlotte Mason never married and did not have children of her own. But she gained a following through these living room talks of actually very influential middle and upper class men and women in Britain in the late 19th century. And that allowed her to start this educational union, the PNEU, or the Parents National Educational Union. And the work of the PNEU, it's an educational organization that was intended to do work to revitalize parenting at the end of the 19th century. Mason argued through the PNEU that parenting was not something that people naturally knew how to do, but something that they might need some help, and you might have to think more deliberately about how to engage in good parenting. Now, what's particularly interesting about her argument is that initially she says her work is for all classes, but ultimately her work ends up being mostly used by middle and upper class families. That's where I would argue she's most influential, is with middle and upper class families. And so it's interesting, I think, there that she gets a following around the idea that, parents need help learning how to be parents at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. This was a somewhat different kind of discourse, I think. So the PNEU as an organization did work like host meetings where parents would hear from speakers. There's a journal of the PNEU, the Parents Review, that published articles monthly related to education and parenting. There's also, they hosted conferences. Eventually, there will be a teacher training college at Ambleside, where governesses and teachers were trained to sort of do the educational work of the PNEU. And I'll tell you more about the educational plan here in just a moment. But they also started the PNEU, the Parents Union School. So what you see on the right side of the screen is this sort of image that represented the Parents Union School and then their motto: I am, I can, I ought, I will. And the Parents Union School is actually the organization that I'm most interested in. So the Parents Union School started right at the end of the 19th century, right before the turn of the century. And it is an organized homeschool curriculum. It provides an organized homeschool curriculum. And I think this is important to note because, of course, the idea of having a sort of home education, that's not new at the end of the 19th century. Plenty of children in middle and upper class households were educated at home, right? What's new about this, though, is the organized nature of it. It looks much more akin to the kinds of homeschool curriculums that parents could purchase today if they wanted to engage in some sort of homeschooling, right? So every semester, Mason's organization sent books, you would complete work, there were exams that got sent back to the home office at the end of the semester, at the end of the term. So it's a much more sort of organized homeschool curriculum. And where I think this becomes interesting is that, of course, as we move into the 20th century, there's a growing conversation amongst families that live in the British Empire about how to educate their children, because the primary sort of idea is that children should be sent from the empire, right? White children should be sent from the empire back to Britain to continue their educations in Britain at British schools. But this, of course, induced long periods of separation between families, and this was hard on families. Also, of course, during the 20th century, events like the First World War and the Second World War made this kind of travel almost impossible. So families were looking for a way to educate their children where they were in the British Empire. And the Parents Union School really ends up stepping in to fill this gap. They make the promise basically that what they can do is they will guarantee that children that work through their curriculum and their homeschool society will be at the end of it fully British citizens, just like other children their same age at school in Britain, whether these, empire children had ever been to Britain or not. And it's a pretty bold promise at a moment when there's an awful lot of anxiety, right, in the early 20th century about the empire and about sort of raising future citizens, future British citizens. Now, the curriculum creates this very sort of family, what I'll call a family project. So, for families living in the British Empire following the school program of the Parents Union School, like I said, every semester they're sent books and sort of a plan of reading. And then at the end, there's at the end of the term, there's an exam that the families are supposed to help to administer to the children. So this is an example from the Form 3 program. So the Form 3 was for children aged 12 to 15. It included the subjects Bible lessons and recitations, English grammar, French, German, and Latin, Italian, which is optional, English, French, and ancient history, singing, writing, dictation, drill, drawing in brush and charcoal, natural history, botany, physiology, geography, arithmetic, geometry, and reading, with 35 books for resources. And you were supposed to be able to do it in half of a day so that during the afternoon, children could be outside playing. It always seems remarkable to me, like a lot to fit in. So these are an example of the history questions for the exam program that came out at the end of the semester that children were responsible to respond to. And both sort of mothers and fathers were implicated in this educational project. So if you look at the complete exam program, it says, mothers do this, fathers do this. So it really there is this idea that it is supposed to be a family project. But even though it's supposed to be a family project, I wouldn't want to minimize the importance of the role of women in this work. One of the things that I think is interesting is Charlotte Mason wrote a series of books where she lays out her philosophy of education. She writes the first one in the 1880s, and the last one is published in the early 1920s, just a few years before her death. The books, I think, are interesting to read. Um, it struck me when I read them for the first time that even though Charlotte Mason doesn't very directly talk about any of the issues of the late Victorian and Edwardian era, that those issues literally crowd the page, they fill the margins. It's impossible to escape the fact that she's thinking about it, right? So of course, one of the issues in the Edwardian era in particular is thinking about the role of women in society, right? And thinking about women's place in society. The suffrage movement had certainly increased these kinds of conversations. And one of the things I see throughout the articles in the Parents' Review, throughout the pages of Charlotte Mason's own writing, is that she's very concerned to claim a place for women, particularly as mothers, um, as citizens. And she wants to say that their work is very important in helping to raise future citizens, and not just any kind of citizen, but future citizens who will help to build the British Empire. And this gets us to girls. So, why look at girls, particularly in the Parents Union School? So, the educational records of the Parents Union School, as far as I can tell, have disappeared. Given that they were sending materials all over the world, there must have been lists of, right, who was enrolled and where they've lived. I can't find them. I can find references to, hundreds of people enrolled and even thousands of people enrolled. But I don't have specific numbers. When I look, though, unofficially at letters from children who talk about being part of the Parents Union School, when I look in the pages of the Parents Review and see who's writing in and what they're talking about, what it seems like is that there are a lot of girls enrolled in the Parents Union School. And this would make sense, right? If you think about Virginia Woolf's discussion of Arthur's education fund and the notion that when funds are tight, right, finances were used to ensure that boys are educated first. It makes sense, I think, that the Parents Union School would uniquely fill a niche with girls. The picture on this page is a photo of the 1912 PNEU gathering at Winchester. Um, Note in the picture here, it's almost all girls. Now, this comes from an album with other pictures from the day. Each age group was asked to come dressed as a particular era in British history. So there are other pictures that include some boys as well, but it is mostly girls, okay? So I think the Parents Union School ends up serving mostly girls and ends up being mostly focused on how to uniquely educate girls. And I think their hope is, the hope of the Parents Union School, is that if you send girls through this particular educational setting, that what will happen is that they will grow up to be good wives and good mothers, and that they themselves will raise future builders of the empire. But I think what happens is actually a little more complicated. So across the pages of the Parents' Review, there are letters from children living across the British Empire who write in and share a little bit about their lives. I wish we had time and I could share lots of these letters, but I'll share just this one, which I think is entirely delightful. So Jane Eliza Hasted lived in India and sent this letter in 1920. This was the conclusion of her letter. I hope you do not think there are tigers and elephants round every corner, as there are not. You have to walk a great many miles in big jungle in order to get to one. I think this is so fascinating because Jane here, right, really acts as an expert. She wants to say, I know. And so let me tell you about what I know in case you don't know it too, right? She takes this role as an expert. And in the letters from girls, they describe their lives and these kinds of stories. There's lots of ways to analyze the letters. But for purposes of this paper, one of the things I want to point out is that the letters don't really talk at all about the girls as wives and mothers. That's not what they're talking about. They don't talk about, oh, today I learned how to cook. And so, someday I can make an excellent, meal for my family. That's not what they talk about. Instead, they talk about this, about being experts in where they live. And it's certainly problematic, right? They are creating knowledge about the British Empire. And that sort of knowledge creation, I think, is very much implicated in empire building, right? They're sort of, yes, they're building empire, but they're not building empire in terms of thinking about their future um, as wives and mothers. They're building empire in a sense by framing themselves as the knowers, right? By framing themselves as scholars, as people, right? As girls interested in these sort of intellectual pursuits and interests. And so, just in this last moment here are my sort of final thoughts. Um, the PNEU's interest, I think, was to address a perceived crisis of femininity by reinvigorating a notion of patriotic and imperial citizenship, particularly for women. The work of the Parents Union School was to educate children, mostly girls, with an education equal to that of their brothers that would prepare them to be future empire builders. Now, I do think the Parents Union School, if their goal is to create future empire builders, they do accomplish that. But they accomplish it in a different role than they think, because their female students don't see that their future, their status as an empire builder is limited to their future lives as wives or mothers. In fact, their students see that their work in helping to build and promote the British Empire is in taking on the role of an expert and a creator of knowledge. And in that way, we really see these girls doing the work of taking, oh, that's my 20-minute warning, taking on the work that the Parents Union School puts before them and reframing it in a slightly different way. So thanks for your time and attention in listening to this. I'll look forward to our online conversations as part of the conference. Happy day, everybody.